Okay, guys. The purpose of this lecture is going to be to take us on a brief overview, hopefully about 15 minutes or so, of Latin America in World War II. Something that is not really something that we've covered much before in the past at Skyline, or something I've talked a ton about, but something that very much needs to be not ignored anymore. Not only given the curriculum, but also as we look at kind of what the Axis and the Allies were doing on a world scale to really turn it into a world war. It's important to think about these things. And so this is going to take you kind of through an overview of the importance of what was going on in Latin America and South America during World War II, how it impacted things, and then most importantly than anything else, the kind of aftermath of that, because that's also going to matter significantly to these guys. Okay, now essentially what I'm going to be arguing through to you throughout the course of this lecture is that Latin America was originally seen as fairly unimportant and taken for granted by the Allies. The United States thought it would naturally be theirs, as it was, quote, in its sphere of influence. Britain and France didn't really care because it had like stronger cultural ties to places like Spain and stuff like that. And so the end result was that Latin America really fell hegemonically into the hands of the Axis to start with, economically, socially, culturally, and politically. And it really took a couple years for the kind of natural move to the Allies that occurred. And this occurred for a couple reasons. Latin America basically, from the majority of it, switched sides. And it occurred because the United States' close proximity. It occurred because they realized that the Allies were eventually going to win the war. And it occurred because the Allies really courted the raw materials of Latin America to try to get them involved. And in doing this, what they did was a number of things. They allowed for increased importance in Latin America, particularly on the world stage. And once the war was over, it allowed places like Brazil to have more of a say in like the post-war order, right? Because they were actually on the winning side in the end. But the end result was also allowed for increased interference in the rest of the Americas by the United States in the Cold War, under the same type of logic and stuff along those lines. Well, we've already gotten involved in this. We've become friends. We might as well like get into that, etc., etc. So for those of you that know things about Operation Condor in the United States during the Cold War in Latin America, this kind of laid the groundwork for that as well. So it had kind of a double-edged sword, if that makes sense, as the end result here. Okay, now the first thing we should understand before I actually get into the bulk of the slides, and by the way, I should credit this. Before I say anything else, I should note that like the vast majority of this information came from a great book that just came out in 2018 called The Tango War that I would highly recommend, and it really tries to deal with the overarching this issue, what was going on in Latin America when North America and Europe and Africa and Asia were all fighting a war, stuff along those lines. And this is where that comes from, just to kind of give it credit here. Now, the first thing you should understand to keep in mind is that there was actually a really high ethnic population of German, Italy, and Italian and Japanese, uh, citizens who had moved to South America for some reason. Okay. Um, there was a Nazi women's league and a Nazi youth league. There were parties for men in uniform saluting themselves all of the Fuhrer. This occurred in Brazil. Meanwhile, in Argentina itself, literally you have like upwards of 8% of Argentinians immigrated directly from Germany. That's astronomically high for that time, like almost 1 in 10. An estimated 2/3 of Argentinians have Italian ancestry. You've got that in there. Meanwhile, Japan, if you're unaware of this, but they've even had Peru's even had a Japanese prime minister, a prime minister with a Japanese name and ethnically Japanese. But Japan had invested hardcore in the west coast of South America, in Peru, in Chile, stuff along these lines. And so the end result was that there was a lot of Axis influence in South America. And the US and FDR knew this, okay? At every single meeting, aside from two, from 1939 to 1941, Latin America was at the top of the armed forces agenda. Okay. Now, there are three key things that are really kind of outlined in the battle in this kind of book, in the battle for like Latin America. And we're going to talk about the battle for the skies, the battle for oil, and the battle for rubber. Okay. And the first part right here is the battle for the skies. Okay. Um, because one of the big things that came in and one of the massive influence that allowed the Axis to have in Latin America was the fact that because Latin America had not really been built up anywhere near as much. If you remember, and we go back to things like this, yes, you had infrastructure, but a lot of the infrastructure was like went from the jungle where the rubber or whatever was right to the city, and then the city right to the port, and the port right back, and not a whole lot in between and stuff along those lines. Okay. Um, You had dirt roads at best. You had flooding. You have landslides. This is still a problem. I mean, when I was in Belize and as recently as like, uh, what was it, 2007 or so? Yeah, about 13 years ago. It's significantly easier to fly around the country in a small plane than it is to drive, just because of the roads. So flying had potential, and the Germans and the Italians knew this. Okay, and to give you an example, the first carrier in South America was established by the Germans a solid 5 years before the United States' first ever carrier, which was Delta. Airfields popped up through Latin America, and 90% of air travel by 1939 was based in and around various Axis companies. And this became a really big deal because it gave them access to the skies in ways that wouldn't happen. It allowed them to like slip blockades, and it allowed Germany and Japan to import things in the air because, Battle of Atlantic, Britain had control of the seas, stuff like that. Well, because of the establishment there, they were able to fly things over and they were able to get things over. And so it really allowed like a lot of the allied things to kind of be ineffective. Okay, and it was that first thing that led the allies to understand, okay, maybe we should like pay attention to this area here. Okay. um the next part comes in, and this is really based in and around in Mexico. Okay, and this is the battle for oil, and this is the other thing the allies realized they should really 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 pay attention to here. Okay. um the Axis is going to be limited hardcore in this war by oil. Hitler is going to invade Germany, pushing over towards the oil fields of Southeast Asia. A large reason for the attack on Pearl Harbor was Japanese hoping to divert the United States so that they could get oil in Malaysia, etc., etc. Interestingly, as it comes out very coincidentally in 1920, Mexico is sitting on one of the largest oil reserves in the entire country. I mean, in the entire world, and definitely the largest in Latin America. Now, Mexico's in a big problem here because for the last like 20, 30 years, if you remember, oil in Mexico and stuff like that have led to lots of issues, lots of pandering to the United States. That was the direct cause of like one of the first strikes in the Mexican American War, or sorry, not Mexican American War, Mexican Revolution of 1910, was dealing with this. And so the PRI doesn't want to pander to the United States. But on the other hand, they don't want to pander to the U.S. On the other hand, they're fairly anti-fascist. I mean, they were the only country to actually protest the Anschluss and stuff like that. Um, eventually, an agreement is reached. Okay, in which um, uh, the Mexico is going to nationalize its oil fields, and the United States are going to still be able to have some like private interest in this, right? But the end result is that the United States, or that Mexico decides that okay, fascism is a bit of a problem, but on the other hand, our historical problems with the United States and nationalism and stuff like that, those really take control. And so Germany and Italy secured approximately 94% of Mexico's oil between March 38 and September of 39. And basically, this is one of the few times that you see the United States completely having to bow to its southern neighbor here, because finally, with Pearl Harbor and the need to get Mexico on the side of the Allies and stuff like that, the United States bows to nationalization and allows like all American oil companies to like leave Mexico. The last thing we want to talk about here occurs in Brazil, and it's probably the most important. Okay, and this is going to be really the battle for rubber. Okay, um, this was really, 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 really important um, for two reasons. One, it was vital for the munition supply of things. You want tanks, you want like move. You need tires, you need rubber, stuff like that. And synthetic rubber was not possible because at the time it required petrol, and that was in short supply too. Okay. On top of all that, the Japanese invasion of Indonesia and Malaysia had taken 90% of the Allies' rubber supply, and like gone. Okay, so the United States knew at this point, okay, and this is the last key battle they've got to win. Okay, the battle for the skies, they've got a problem with. The battle for oil, they've got a problem with. But if they're going to win a battle here, they've got to win the battle for oil. The United States and the Allies know that the best place to get oil is the Amazon, but they also know that like anti-imperialist pseudo-fascist Getulio Vargas is a natural ally of the Axis. Eventually, this ends up, and this is the big battle that's won. To be honest, the Axis really win the battle for the skies, and they really win the battle for oil for the most part. But the battle for rubber that matters the most is the one called Plan Rubber. Okay, and it's actually a secret thing known in the Washington Accords. And in this, the deal is that the United States agrees to build airfields and rubber plantations in northwest Brazil so that it can import and stuff like that, and drop a bunch of money into that. And Brazil is going to drop its neutrality in turn for like a post war post war role in that world, in like the post 1945 world. And Brazil's actually going to be the only Latin American country to see like real legitimate combat with a number of their ships involved in this thing. Um, it leads, and you can see on this some of the propaganda around this, but it leads to Getulio Vargas, and other people, and this is one of the major kind of side fallouts in this, encouraging poor and indigenous workers to basically go work on these rubber fields. And there's about a 60% death rate in this time, which is massively, massively high. And this is something Brazil is still dealing with itself. So this is, as I said, one of the big fallouts of this is that the people that have to go work on this rubber fields and do it that are said to are generally people at lower population that have had problems in most of Brazil's like sphere. These are descendants of slaves and stuff like that, and now they're being kind of crapped on even more. So there's a lot of negative parts to that too. But in the end, the ability to produce rubber out of Brazil is a large part. By the middle of the war, the Allies are able to produce what they need, and the United States production power is through the roof, whereas the Axis literally don't have the materials to produce what they actually need to be able to fight this war, and this is a large, large, large part of it. Okay, now that we've talked about the actual like impact on the like political and military side of it, I want to talk about the social impact on the population here. And the first thing we want to talk about is undesirables and eugenics, because um, much like you saw throughout other parts of the world, once Hitler and the Nazis have given the green light to this, there are certain places that decide that, they also are going to use this as an excuse to get rid or to like highlight anti-Semitism or get rid of Jews for some reason or stuff along those lines. And because of things like the Reconquista and the Inquisition and stuff like that, there is a long history of Spanish Jews migrating to the New World. Okay, as a matter of fact, Argentina has one of the largest Jewish populations going. There's a big influx in the 1880s, and like the comparative um, mentality, the comparative mentality was that like the New World was comparatively more free during those pogroms and stuff along those lines. And what the rise of Hitler really did was it gave a lot of voice to anti-Semitism in Latin America, but the one thing we should note is, unlike in Europe, it did not give a lot of action to Latin American anti-Semitism. The most notable example was Getulio Vargas, who used some people who were Jews claiming that they were communists because Hitler had linked Jews and communists together, and therefore he wanted to arrest Brazil's communists and put them away. But there are not mass roundups in most countries, other than that one place in Brazil. There are not deportations and murders and stuff along those lines. There is lots of anti-Semitism. There is lots of refusal to buy. There is lots of just kind of turning a cold shoulder. Like, for example, nobody really lets Jews in. Hitler tried to kick them out, and none of these countries really take them or anything like that. And a few countries even like turn them away. There's this whole story with a ship and a bunch of Jews refugees, and eventually they're turned away and stuff along those lines. And so that kind of gives tacit okaying to like this type of like action on the part of the Nazis. And the fact that the Catholic Church doesn't provide any protection, as some people criticize later, but it really is one of those things that like aids in the fact of the Holocaust and stuff like that, and should be mentioned and brought up, but doesn't see the violent action that is seen in Latin America at that point. Now, what you do see, though, and by the way, when I said violent action, I meant doesn't see the violent action that's seen in Europe at that point. What you do see, though, is Japanese internment in Latin America. And for those of you that don't know the background on this, in the United States, Executive Order 9066 had called for, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, had called for all people of Japanese descent on the West Coast to be removed from their home and interned in camps. You'll do a lot more on that last year. There was a lot of paranoia on this, right? Great trivia question. The only time the Rose Bowl's ever been played outside of Pasadena, California, was when it was played at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina in 1942, because Duke was in the Rose Bowl and they did not want to have a large gathering on the West Coast, so they played it at Duke instead. All right, now that I'm done with that little plug, we'll go back to this. So because of this paranoia and stuff like that, Japanese Americans have been taken and put in camps. It happened. It's a sad fact. It's something we'll go into a lot on next year. One of those camps was in Puyallup, for example, at where the state fairgrounds are. However, in Latin America, um, Roosevelt talked Peru and other people into interning Japanese citizens and sending them into the U.S. This is one of the more hidden things that the United States did wrong during this time that was a major problem. Basically, the deal was this: was that the United States could not. Japan had gone around and arrested American citizens when war had been declared, ambassadors, stuff like that. The United States could not legally, according to our Constitution, send American citizens back to Japan. So what they had Peru do was they had Peru arrest a number of or arrest a number of Japanese living in their territory, have them sent to the U.S., and then exchange those Japanese prisoners for Americans living in Japan that had been brought at that time. And this is problematic. This is displacement. This is literally what you're looking at is one country pressuring another into rounding up some of its own residents, sending them up to the United States, and then having them interned in camps there and stuff like that. Now, to be clear, these are camps where people live and work. They are not death camps, and they are not worked to death. It is not the same as a concentration camp in Europe or something like that. But you have about a total of 4,000 people who are brought around to Texas forcibly and just never allowed to return to Peru because of the impact of the United States' influence in Latin America. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning when I said the thing with the thesis about how like this would allow the United States to saddle up to Latin America and then kind of like not fully let go or anything along those lines that would lead to like some of the issues in the Cold War. Not that we hadn't been doing that the whole time, but it just gave us yet another excuse. Um, the last thing I want to talk about that's kind of a postscript, okay, because that really covers the vast majority of what occurred both socioculturally and politically and economically in Latin America during World War II, is something called rat lines, and you may have heard of this before. But at the end of the war, there are a number of high-ranking Nazis who escape the war, and most of them escape on what's called rat lines with the help of the Catholic Church and anti-communist sentiment and stuff along those lines. And most of them escape to places in Latin America, most famously Brazil and Argentina. Okay. Um, the Nazis had a secret slush fund with fake money where they had, been able to like put a bunch of money to the Red Cross, get resettlement passports, and then kind of secretly like move around and stuff along those lines. And there's some dictators like Vargas, like Juan Perón in Argentina, who we'll talk about a little bit later on, who see their European societies as racism as both whiter and more industrious, and therefore kind of tacitly encourage getting people to immigrate here. And what that means is former Nazis. So the most famous one is a dude by the name of Adolf Eichmann, who was actually eventually tracked down by Israel, brought back, tried for war crimes, and executed in Israel. But Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, escapes on a rat line over to Latin America. Approximately 10,000 Nazis made their way to Latin America over the next 20 years or so. And it's something that I wanted to bring up as kind of an also kind of fall out of this part and some of the like ideas of, okay, we'll support Vargas, we'll support Perón, people like that, as long as they help us win the war. It doesn't matter if there's problems with the indigenous population and 60% of them die, or if they arrest Peruvians and send them to the United States, as long as they help us win the war, that's fine. And the end result of that is sometimes fallout along these lines. Coincidentally, I'll end it with this, just for those of you sitting at home with not a whole lot to do during COVID-19. If you haven't checked out the show on Amazon Prime called Hunters, you absolutely should if this type of thing interests you. It's part fact, part fiction, but it's based on this idea of what happened to the Nazis afterwards and rat lines and Nazis making their way out and stuff along those lines. It's got Al Pacino. I'd highly recommend it. All right, guys, that's it for today. We will talk about the middle part of the war from basically Stalingrad to D-Day in the middle of the week. See you guys soon. Hope everybody's doing well.